Have you ever wondered why the Middle East never seems to rest? Why a land no bigger than a small U.S. state commands the headlines, stirs global passions, and ignites conflicts that echo through the centuries? Why does Israel, a nation with fewer people than most major cities, continue to be at the center of prophecy, controversy, and war? More importantly, if God truly chose Israel, has He changed His mind? Has the favor of the Almighty shifted to another people? Or is there a deeper purpose that most of the world has refused to see today? I invite you to pause whatever noise surrounds your life, because this question isn't just about geopolitics. It isn't only about religion or history. This is about your faith, about the credibility of Scripture itself, and about whether the God who promised never to abandon His people can be trusted to keep His word to you. If He broke His covenant with them, what makes you think He won't break it with you? But if He has not abandoned them, then what does that mean for the unfolding of history and your place within it? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may shake your assumptions and deepen your understanding of the God who moves empires and raises nations for His glory. For centuries, many in the church have wrestled with a dilemma. They read of God's unbreakable promises to Abraham, "I will make of you a great nation, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Yet they also see Israel rejecting Jesus, the very Messiah they long for. Some have concluded that Israel forfeited its unique role, that God moved on, choosing the church as the new Israel. Others believe that the modern nation of Israel is merely a political accident, unworthy of any spiritual significance. But what if both views are incomplete? What if the story of Israel is still unfolding, not in spite of their failures, but because of them? What if God's purpose in allowing their blindness was not to discard them, but to teach the entire world about grace, judgment, and redemption? Before we can answer whether Israel remains God's chosen people, we need to understand why God chose them in the first place and what He always intended to do through them. Long before Israel ever lost her independence, before Babylon burned the temple to the ground, before exiles wept by the rivers of a foreign land, God whispered a name into the silence of history: Cyrus, a pagan king from a nation that didn't yet exist as an empire, a man who would never worship the God of Israel as his own, and yet God called him my anointed. Imagine the scandal of it. For the prophets of Israel to record that God would use a foreign ruler, a Gentile conqueror, to fulfill His promise. It offended the pride of a people who believed only their bloodline could carry divine favor. And yet this is precisely where the question of Israel's chosenness begins. Because the story of Cyrus isn't only about a king who let exiles return. It's about a God who refuses to be limited by ethnicity or politics. A God who will use anyone, even those who do not acknowledge Him, to accomplish His plans. If He could anoint Cyrus to liberate His people, could He not also appoint the rise and fall of modern nations for His purpose? If He orchestrated Persia's ascent centuries before it happened, how much more might He be weaving a plan through the tensions between Iran and Israel today? Picture the captives in Babylon, humiliated, grieving, certain that God had abandoned them forever. They had lost everything that defined them: their king, their land, their temple, their sense of identity as God's chosen nation. Yet in that darkness, a promise burned brighter than any torch. Isaiah's words, "I will raise up Cyrus in righteousness. He will set my exiles free." This was not a wishful hope. It was a declaration of God's character, a covenant too sturdy to collapse under the weight of their unfaithfulness. When the walls of Jerusalem fell, God's faithfulness did not. When the temple burned, His purposes remained unscorched. When His people wept by foreign rivers, heaven was still watching, counting every tear, remembering every promise. It is no accident that the same God who named Cyrus centuries before his birth also foretold another event still unfulfilled, a final assault on Israel by nations from the region we call Iran. If he kept the promise, then will he not keep it again? Perhaps you have never cared much about Israel. Maybe the idea of modern-day prophecy seems like superstition to you. But here is why this matters. If God abandoned his covenant with Israel, every promise in your Bible is on trial. Your hope of salvation, your confidence that he will finish the work he began in you, your assurance that nothing can separate you from his love. It all stands or falls on this truth: God does not lie. God does not break his word. God does not discard what he has chosen. And if you can see his faithfulness to Israel across millennia of betrayal and repentance, exile and return, you will have unshakable confidence that he will be faithful to you. Because the same God who promised to scatter them also vowed to gather them again. The same God who allowed their blindness promised to open their eyes in the end. The same God who used a pagan king to rescue them will not fail to fulfill every last detail of his redemptive plan. Stay with me. In part 2, we will trace the 4 times God intervened to rescue Israel from Persia, from Cyrus to Esther, and see how each event foreshadowed a greater deliverance yet to come. We will also confront the deeper question: if Israel is still chosen, what does that mean for the church, for history, and for your faith? When you trace the steps of God's interventions through history, you begin to realize that each moment was not merely a rescue mission, but a revelation of his character, a window into how he moves through nations and hearts to accomplish what no human scheme could ever achieve. And the first intervention was perhaps the most astonishing, because it involved the rise of a king who had no allegiance to the God of Israel, a man named Cyrus, whose name was whispered by the prophets a century and a half before he was born, while Israel still basked in the illusion that their kingdom would never fall yet. Even as Babylon prepared its siege engines and the armies of Nebuchadnezzar marched toward Jerusalem, God's promise was already written. Cyrus would rise. He would conquer Babylon without a battle. He would issue a decree that would reverse 70 years of humiliation. And more than that, he would become an unwitting servant of the living God. Imagine the scene as the Jewish exiles gathered in the public square of Babylon to hear the royal proclamation. A scroll was unrolled, and a Persian official declared that by order of Cyrus, king of Persia, the captives were free to return, free to rebuild the temple, free to worship the God who had never forgotten them. In that moment, it was as if the dry bones of Ezekiel's vision began to rattle, as if the impossible was suddenly undeniable. But what most people forget is that Cyrus did more than sign a decree. He returned the sacred treasures stolen by Babylon. He funded the reconstruction, and he acknowledged that the God of heaven had appointed him to do it. This was not religious tolerance, it was divine orchestration. And in that moment, God demonstrated that he can stir the heart of any ruler, even those who do not know his name, to fulfill his purposes. But Cyrus was only the beginning. The second intervention unfolded in the very heart of the Persian court, where a man named Daniel had been carried off as a boy, exiled into a culture determined to erase his faith. Yet Daniel refused to compromise. He would not bow to idols. He would not abandon prayer. And as the empire shifted from Babylon to Persia, God elevated Daniel to a place of extraordinary influence. It was Daniel who interpreted the writing on the wall the night Babylon fell. It was Daniel who survived the schemes of jealous officials who resented his integrity. And it was Daniel who, when the decree was signed, forbidding prayer to any god but the king, flung open his windows and knelt to pray, as he always had, knowing it might cost him his life, as his enemies dragged him before Darius and accused him of defying the law. The king was stricken with regret. But the edict could not be revoked, and so Daniel was lowered into a den of lions. A stone was rolled across the opening, and all through the night the man of God sat in darkness, surrounded by predators whose hunger could not overcome the sovereign hand that closed their jaws at dawn. The king rushed to the den, calling out with a trembling voice. And when Daniel's voice echoed back strong and unbroken, it was more than a personal deliverance. It was a declaration that no decree of man can silence the faithfulness of God. Darius issued a new proclamation, not to honor himself, but to proclaim that the God of Daniel is the living God whose kingdom shall never end. And so the Persian Empire itself became the stage for the defense of God's people and the vindication of his name. The third intervention unfolded not in the court of kings, but in the hidden chambers of a palace where a young woman named Esther carried a secret that could save or doom her people, when Haman, consumed by pride and ancient hatred, manipulated Xerxes into signing an irrevocable decree to exterminate every Jew in the empire. It seemed as though the covenant would finally be broken, that the promise would die in blood. But God had already positioned Esther, an orphan, turned queen, for such a time as this. When Mordecai urged her to risk everything, she replied with words that still echo in every heart that has ever stood before danger. "If I perish, I perish." She approached the king unbidden, her heart pounding, her life balanced on the mercy of a sovereign who could end it with a gesture. But God had prepared the moment Xerxes extended. The scepter listened to her plea, and soon Haman hung from the gallows he had built for Mordecai. The edict was reversed, and the Jewish people defended themselves, turning annihilation into triumph. What was meant to be their end became another testament that no weapon formed against them could prosper. Each of these interventions, Cyrus, Daniel, Esther, was a living illustration that God's promises do not expire. His faithfulness is not diminished by centuries or by empires, and even in the foreign lands of exile, he remained their defender. Yet the fourth intervention has not yet happened. It is a prophecy that still looms over history, a warning recorded by Ezekiel of a final coalition that will rise from the north, led by Gog, joined by Persia, modern Iran, and their allies. They will advance like a storm to erase Israel from the map. They will march in arrogance, convinced that no one will stop them. And in that moment, when Israel appears defenseless, God declares that his fury will rise. Earthquakes will shake the land, fire and brimstone will rain from the sky. And the armies of Gog and Magog will be shattered, not by Israeli defense systems or alliances with Western powers, but by the raw, unstoppable power of the God who swore that he would never abandon his people. This final intervention will not be a myth or a metaphor. It will be a demonstration to every nation that God's covenant is irrevocable, and the world will know that he alone is Lord. But here is what many fail to see. If Israel has no spiritual significance today, then why would God promise to defend them in the end if they were no longer his people? Whom would he be defending? And why would the prophets declare that this final deliverance is coming? The answer, uncomfortable for some and undeniable for others, is that Israel remains chosen, not because they have earned it, but because God's purposes are bigger than human failures, and his word is stronger than history itself. As we watch the tensions rise in our time, as alliances form and threats are exchanged, we are not witnessing random chaos. We are witnessing the unfolding of prophecy, a plan set in motion long before any modern nation existed. And if you can see it, you will understand that God's faithfulness to Israel is the guarantee of his faithfulness to you, that what he started, he will finish, and that no power on earth can annul the promise he swore by his own name. And now, as you stand on the threshold of all this history and prophecy converging, You have to ask yourself, what does it mean for you? Because the story of Israel is not simply about an ancient people clinging to old traditions. It is the mirror God holds up to your heart, revealing whether you trust His faithfulness when everything looks lost, whether you believe in His promises even when the evidence seems to vanish, and whether you can endure seasons of exile in your own life without surrendering to despair. When the prophet Ezekiel saw the valley of dry bones, it was a vision more terrible and beautiful than anything he had ever witnessed. Thousands of bones scattered under the sun. Silent testimony to a people who believed their hope had died forever. And yet in that desolation, God commanded him to speak to call the impossible into existence. And when he obeyed, the bones began to rattle, to rise, to assemble into bodies waiting for breath. That moment was not only about Israel's return from exile, it was a picture of every human heart that has ever wondered if it was too late for redemption, too late for purpose, too late for God to do something new. And so he asked the question that he still asks today. Son of man, can these bones live? Can the marriage that feels lifeless, the faith that has withered, the dreams buried by disappointment, can they live again? Your answer, like Ezekiel's, may be only the sovereign Lord you alone know. And that confession is enough for God to begin, because the same breath that swept through that valley is the Spirit He still sends to revive the hearts of those willing to trust Him. And if you look carefully at the rebirth of Israel, at the return of a people who wandered for 2,000 years, only to rise again as a nation, in a single day, you will see a glimpse of that same power, a proof that no matter how long something has been dead, no matter how scattered the pieces, God can call it back to life. But the restoration of Israel is not complete. There is a day coming when their eyes will be opened, when they will look upon the one they pierced and weep with the grief of recognition. And on that day, the final chapter of this ancient covenant will be fulfilled. The prophet Zechariah describes it without hesitation. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. This is not a metaphor. It is the ultimate reconciliation of a people who were chosen, not because they were better, but because God needed a vessel through whom He would reveal His mercy to the world. If you have ever wondered why the Middle East is always at war, why hatred rages in ancient rivalries, why the nations plot and scheme and threaten, you must understand that beneath every headline is the deeper conflict between the purposes of God and the rebellion of humanity. The sons of Isaac and the sons of Ishmael still contend for a birthright that can only be fulfilled through the cross. And every attempt to solve these tensions without Jesus is destined to fail, for there is no lasting peace, no ultimate restoration, apart from the one who came to break down the dividing wall and make one new humanity from the two. This is why your faith matters in this story, because you are not a spectator. You are an heir grafted into the olive tree. Paul described a participant in the mystery that God would extend His grace to all nations and yet not forget His covenant with Israel. And so you must hold this tension in your heart, refusing to despise Israel for their blindness or exalt them as if they are saved apart from Christ. The truth is simple. There is no other name under heaven by which anyone can be saved. Not heritage, not tradition, not even the ancient promises can replace the cross. Yet there is also no force that can cancel the love God has for the descendants of Abraham. And if you want to have an unshakable confidence that He will finish what He began in, you look at Israel, look at the ashes from which they rose, look at the prophecies fulfilled despite every empire that tried to erase them. Look at the unbroken thread of divine commitment that refuses to let go. if he kept his covenant through millennia of betrayal, exile, and return. He will keep his promise to you, the God who moved the heart of Cyrus, who closed the mouths of lions, who raised a queen in secret to save a people doomed to die. That God is still alive, still faithful, still writing the final chapters of the story, and he invites you to trust him with your own, perhaps. Today you feel like those dry bones scattered by sin or disappointment. Perhaps you have given up hope that God could ever breathe life into your valley again. But let the testimony of Israel be the sign you need. No promise of God ever fails, no purpose of his ever falls to the ground, and no darkness can extinguish the light he has sworn to bring. The day is coming when all Israel will be saved, not by politics or armies, but by the grace that flows from the pierced hands of the Messiah they once rejected. And if you belong to him, you too are part of this unbreakable story. So lift up your eyes, anchor your faith in the God who finishes what he starts, and let this truth shape your courage. Your prayers and your hope for you have not been grafted into a dead tree, but into a living covenant that will outlast every empire. And when the final trumpet sounds, when the King returns in glory, you will stand alongside every redeemed heart, Jew and Gentile, one family, purchased by the same precious blood. And you will see with your own eyes that no promise God ever spoke was wasted.